Well, greetings out there in YouTube land. It's a glorious day here at Uncle Doug and Jack's workshop. So let's go on inside and see what project we have lined up for today's festivities. Our subject today is going to be this little jewel here, which actually came with its own cover. Now, I'm not accustomed to ever seeing really old amps, small, compact ones like this especially, that have their very own custom-made cover. This is not something that somebody's wife cooked up for them. This is actually a commercial cover with the flap here that goes under the handle and all of that. When we lift it off, we see a really nice and very, very original wrinkle-painted single-ended amp. Let's take it completely apart, see what makes it work or not work, and check out the type of circuit it has and what it takes to make it sound really good. First off, it's very compact, 13 inches tall and 10 inches wide. It has the original handle still intact, which is extremely uncommon. You know this is the original handle because these are still the rivets on these brackets. If these had been drilled out to put in a new handle at some time, there would be screws here instead of rivets. Second, let's examine the almost flawless and very impressive wrinkle paint job. It's got a gold base coat with a white finish over it that has crackled and separated, and then I assume was clear coated to preserve it. About the only discoloration is this one here on the side, probably from the ricochet of some groupie's undies during a performance, possibly at Wembley Stadium. Looking at the grill cloth, it looks almost too good. This looks sort of like the grill cloth you'd see in old radios. We'll go inside and see if it looks to us like the grill cloth has been replaced. However, when you figure that this has probably been under that protective cover for the vast majority of its life, and that the paint, which is rather fragile, is in perfect shape, it's altogether possible that this is the original grill cloth. And it appears that we still have the original power cord. I believe the plug itself may have been changed because I think this is one of those plugs you can squeeze these prongs together and pull the inside out and attach the cord to it. I'll try and see, but regardless, I do have a feeling this is the power cord that the amp came with. Any white paint spots on top would probably be camouflaged by the white top coat and the wrinkle paint. So we'll just take it for granted they've got to be there because they always are, but I really can't see any specific ones. Once again though, maybe they were on the top of the protective cover. And sure enough, looking at the protective cover, there they are, the ubiquitous white paint spots. Incredible. Now let's turn it around and take a look at the innards. We see the Rolla fuel coil speaker is in beautiful shape, and that the little nuts and bolts holding it in show absolutely no signs of wear, any tool marks or anything like that on them. Also, the grill cloth has got that kind of random, just sort of slapped in place look that you find on original grill cloth. So based on the originality of these nuts and the look of that cloth, I'm thinking this is a totally original amp. Now, I'm thinking that the speaker here may be rotated 90 degrees. Let me show you why I think that. As you can see, the speaker is rotated 90 degrees clockwise. Now, that would make sense so that this is not interfering with the tubes. But look at the proximity here between what I believe is a 6V6 and the fuel coil housing. Imagine if these two were touching, you'd have all sorts of microphonic problems. I'm thinking this speaker might be better off if it's rotated another 90 degrees clockwise so that this flat is right along here, giving plenty of clearance for this tube. If we look over here at the license notice, You may think that you can get some information about who made the amp, but such is not the case. All they're concerned with is that they are using certain patented features in the circuit or the chassis, and they are giving credit for those patents as they are required to by law. You can read this if you wish just by pausing the video. Now let's look at the chassis. Two inputs. We don't know about their impedance, if they're the same or different. We'll find that out. We've got a volume control here that seems like the knob is loose on the shaft and that the shaft is frozen solid. So that's going to take a little work. There is no telling what this number refers to, 55330. I can't imagine. I think this amp is much earlier than 1955, so maybe we'll find some other clues inside. It's got that little insert screwed fuse holder which we see in older amps, typical toggle, and then that old, wretched, but twisted AC power cord entering a little brass grommet. Let's look at the tubes. Okay, I'm going to have to pull them out in a minute, but I can tell you this one is a 6N7, a 6C5, a 6V6, and a 5Y3. The power transformer is at the rear there, and it's one of those that's recessed where it sits way down low in the chassis. One last detail of note, the little originally rubber feet that were screwed in at the four corners have since disintegrated, leaving in this case one screw head and a bunch of dried up wretched old rubber and guaranteed scratches on your wife's prize end table. So we're going to unscrew these old jewels and replace them with some new modern rubber feet to maintain domestic tranquility. Now that we have it in this position, let's unscrew the four screws that are holding in the chassis. Once again, it's nice to see all four of them. It's nice to see that all four of them match. I got to say, this is the first amp in years where that's been the case. Generally there's like what, one here, one's a wood screw, and the other is a God knows what, a toggle bolt or something. In this case, it's always nice to see originals like this. It lets you start to sort of lull into the belief that this is actually an unmolested, completely original, what, 60 or 70-year-old amplifier. Looking at the heads of the four screws that held the chassis in place, as well as the four matching washers and lock washers, it's evident that there's been almost no wear or removal of these screws, and therefore that the circuit is probably not required much, if any, service in its lifetime. Have you ever noticed when you have four screws to remove, three always come out without a lot of trouble, and then the fourth one turns out to be a real pain in the butt and will fight you to the death? Such is the case with this one. But perseverance always pays off, so now they're all out. These rubber feet look to me like that blackjack chewing gum that you find stuck under the diner table, okay? I'm sure it probably tastes about like it too. I'll find out later. Just when we thought that our feral cat menagerie was full, look what showed up here on our front doorstep. A emaciated, young, probably 7-8 month old, we think, female cat. She's very lovable. You can pet her and rub her back, which is simply a line of vertebrae. She has no fat at all. Probably hasn't eaten in God knows how long. But we gave her a full can of food, which she wolfed down, and some dry food, plenty of water, and we're going to give her a safe place to live here while she recovers and gains her weight back and turns into the healthy, beautiful kitty that we know she will be. I'm going to include some snippets of her recovery in future videos, and I hope that you will enjoy them and share in the happiness that we feel when we can take a little animal like this that's had just a miserable life and give it a really nice one. Okay, so stay tuned. Okay, I've pulled the chassis out of the cabinet and am astounded by the immaculate condition of the top of the chassis. Normally, what do we find? Rat urine, all kinds of mouse fur, and roach eggs all together in just a splendid combination. But in this case, probably due to that really nice snug-fitting protective cover, our chassis looks like it's, what, about 1 or 2 years old? Very nice. Isn't it a shame that all old amps didn't come with nice tight-fitting covers? Now that the tubes have been pulled out of the chassis, we'll look to see if the sockets are marked, and they are, and the marks agree with the tubes that were in these sockets. This is a check you really need to make. It's almost too obvious, but as we'll see in a video that I will post in the future, sometimes people will slip in other tubes, and you can really save yourself a lot of grief if you can figure that out early on before you try to make the amp work with the improper tube that they've inflicted upon you. But in this case, the tubes are legit. So let's take a look at them. The first tube is a 6N7 in the old Lincoln top hat type metal case. I commented once before, but it's worth mentioning. The metal case is attached to pin 1. So if you ground the socket pin 1, it's as if you have a shield over the tube. Always a nice touch. 6N7s were a fairly early tube from the, say, mid to late 30s. They are a duo triode with a shared cathode. In that respect, they're very much like the 6SC7, which replaced it. The 6N7 is a very early tube. 6SC7 replaced it and is still, in its own right, a fairly early tube. This is more from the 40s and 50s, whereas this is more from the late 30s. The amplification factor for the 6N7 is around 35. Second tube, one you probably don't see very often, a 6C5. This is another tube that was popular from 1935 up to around 1939 or 40. It helps us date the amp. If we look at the 6C5, it's simply a triode. It has a rather low amplification factor of only 20, and it was replaced by the 6J5. So this is a tube that many of us have heard of, whereas the 6C5 that came before this is much less common. The third tube is a 6V6, and it's the rather large globe version, sort of the Coke bottle shaped globe version of the 6V6. And most of you are used to the smaller, more tubular, and more modern 6V6s. So this is a very early form of the tube. We know that the 6V6 is a pentode and is used in just about every amp I've ever made a video of. Okay, so I think we're fairly familiar with it. The only thing that's unusual is its large size, which does create some clearance problems with that field coil housing of the speaker. And the last tube is a very familiar one, the 5Y3. What isn't familiar, though, is the large globe shape of the tube glass envelope. Okay, this then is a very early form of the 5Y3. We know that 5Y3s are just like white specks of paint, ubiquitous in early amps. They're a very simple, basic type of rectifier which has a combined filament and cathode. It's called a direct heated cathode. If you look at a GZ34, it'll have a separate filament, and that gives us that slow startup that we like, sort of like a built-in standby switch. And the reason is, it's just like when you set a pan on the stove. Let's say that the cathode's the pan and the filament's the stove. The heat has to sort of jump a gap to start heating that cathode if you have the indirectly heated type cathode like in GZ34s. 5Y3s, however, direct heated cathode, it's going to heat up really fast and not give us the slow startup that we've come to sort of appreciate with amps that have GZ34s and other indirectly heated cathode rectifiers. So what do we make of this tube set? I'm going to go out on a limb and say they're all original tubes for several reasons. Number one, the early globe forms are hard to come by nowadays, so any modern replacement would be the later tubular form. But more than that, look at who made them. All four of them are Sylvania tubes. What are the odds of, say, the 6v6 failing and somebody running over to their tube stash and finding a large Coke bottle globe 6v6 that also was a Sylvania tube with the identical logo of all the other tubes that are still in place in the amp? I'm going to bet you these are the original tubes in this amp. Although we don't have a schematic, I've taken a quick glance at the circuit and I can explain to you exactly how it works looking at these tube diagrams. We have two separate inputs. They appear to have identical impedance to ground, so they'll probably be of equal gain. They come in here to the grids of the 6 and 7. Then the plates output a signal to the volume control, and then a single signal is sent over here to the grid of the 6C5 as a second stage of preamplification, and from that plate then we come over here to the control grid of the 6V6 for output to the speakers. It differs from most small amplifier circuits in that it has two stages of preamplification before sending the signal to the 6V6. Therefore, I expect it to have a pretty good gain in volume, okay, more so than simply a two-tube amp, and let's hope really good tone. We'll see in just a few minutes. One rather amusing aside here, after I got the amp running, I found that only one of the inputs was controlled by the volume control. The other one ran straight through to the grid of the 6C5. Apparently in the old days, people like to either use the instrument volume control and just have their signal go straight through the preamp, or they could use the amplifier's volume control. Well, nowadays the last thing you want is to turn the volume all the way down on the amp, and of course have your guitar set at 10, and plug it in and blow the windows out of your amp room. So I changed the theory of this, and instead of giving this input a shortcut to the 6C5, I ran it over here so that both of them go through the volume control. Now it's time to pull out the chassis so we can take a close look. And this is one of the downfalls of steel coil speakers. Normally you have to go in and unsolder the two speaker leads so you can pull out your chassis. Well, we've got 4 leads here, which sort of adds to the confusion, and almost always the ends are concealed inside like a conduit box like this. So it makes it a little difficult to extract your chassis unless you want to go in here and unsolder all 4 of these wires. There is another option, however, and it's the one I'm going to use, and that is we're going to pull out the speaker very gently at the same time and just set it down beside the chassis while we work on the circuit. Now I was able to remove the nuts and washers from the speaker with my fingers. They were snug but not all that tight, and look, again, a perfectly matching set of nuts, washers, and lock washers with no tool marks whatsoever on them. I'm thinking this is probably the first time that this speaker has been out of the amplifier cabinet. While we have the cabinet bare like this, we'll check to make sure that all our joints are tight and well glued, that our speaker cloth is held down tightly, and it looks like there'll be no repairs necessary on this cabinet. Let's take a look at this speaker cone. It's absolutely flawless. I don't see any evidence of wear anywhere. It's perfect. And really stiff so that we know the suspension then is not worn out. I'm not thrilled that there's no dust cover down here though to keep dirt and debris from getting between the voice coil tube and the pole piece, but after what, 60 or 70 years there is no debris, and you can see there never was a dust cover. So I'm kind of tempted to leave it like this. So now I'm going to set the speaker to the rear so that the cable's stretched out here, and now I'm going to flip over the chassis so we can see the circuit. Okay, here's the chassis, and you see a bunch of these giant solar electrolytic filter caps. This down here makes you think that there's been some soldering done. Either at the factory they were a little sloppy, or somebody has replaced some filter caps at some time in the distant past, because these are antiques in their own right. Other than the really not very functional volume control, everything here looks pretty good. Just for fun, I'm going to test the ESR values on these big electrolytics. Okay, this one gives a very respectable ESR value of 1.7. But look at this. This is kind of peculiar. Let's look at this one back here. It's really showing infinite resistance, and for that reason this one seems to be very faulty. This one seems to be very good. Rather strange, sort of contradictory, because they appear to be the same age. Let's try this one back here. Okay, let's look at this one back here, and it has a very unrespectable ESR value of 23, which is at least 10 times what it ought to be. So it appears then that the filter caps have pretty well bitten the dust and will have to be replaced. Now, I don't skimp when it comes to extremely sophisticated soldering tools. Here, let me give you a quick tour. An Archer, a Radio Shack soldering gun that I bought probably 30 years ago. A $6 soldering iron I just got on eBay, and it works better than most I've ever had. Some 6040 lead solder. Look at your solder label, and if you see the word silver anywhere on it, take that roll of solder and throw it in the trash pail, because all it's going to give you is cold solder joints. You want 6040 lead solder. And then some soldering paste or flux. I think it's just beeswax, and for some reason wherever you put this on metal, the solder will go there and will stick. So this really enhances the soldering process. So I've got here about a 50-year-old tub of beeswax flux, probably what, $25 worth of soldering irons, and the most critical element of all, the 6040 lead solder. People ask me all the time about what equipment they should buy to work on amps. And I'm going to tell you first off, this is about all you need. This and about a $40 digital multimeter. Okay, a $6 soldering iron, some 6040 solder, and a simple meter. And in fact, I bought my last one on eBay and I love it. Okay, you can have oscilloscopes, you can have variacs and all sorts of fancy equipment. And later on, as you advance in your skills and knowledge, those devices may become very helpful. But meanwhile, a really good tech gets by with basic equipment and basic knowledge. And that's pretty much what we got here. Those who go out and buy like $5,000 worth of scopes and meters and all that remind me of the golfers who shoot like in the 200s, but they've got a $10,000 wardrobe that they wear out to play golf. And Lee Trevino used to tell a good story. He'd show up like in some old ragged Levi's and a shredded t-shirt, And the snoots at the country club would laugh at him, and he would bet them like $1,000 he could beat them. And as good hustlers do, he'd probably lose a couple times and then just clean them all out. So it's not what you're wearing, it's what you know. Okay, and basic tools work just fine as long as you know enough to use them. Another thing people ask me all the time is, how can I work on this? I don't have a schematic for it. Yeah, well, I don't have a schematic either. I don't even know the brand of this amp. What am I supposed to go do a Google search for brown chassis? Look, I think schematics have their place. If this were a heavily modified circuit, somebody had gone in here like an idiot with a chainsaw and just screwed everything up, and I have a nice schematic, I can put it back to original. Okay, in that case, that would be very helpful. But this looks to me like a fairly original circuit, except I think these were probably replaced at some time or other. And since it probably worked afterwards, then they were placed correctly. So I'm just going to go in and put in new components in these places and wire them in the same way they are wired, and I bet you it works. We'll see in just a minute. And this is my extremely expensive imported electrolytic capacitor remover. It's made by a company in Detroit called China, and I believe they have them at Harbor Freight, but I warn you, they're not cheap. Okay, so using it, I have removed these stinky old capacitors. How about that? Okay, these are both 8 microfarad at 450 working volts with the ability to resist surges up to 525 volts, which is fine and dandy. I don't happen to have any 8s on hand, so I'm going to go with 10s at 450. This is the working voltage, and unspoken and unwritten on most of these is the fact that they have a surge resistance which probably is at least 525 volts. So these will be ideal replacements for these. Notice I went up a little bit in my capacitance, but I did not go down at all in my working voltage. Also, while we're down here, notice that we have 2 cathode bypass caps, 10 microfarad at 25, 30 at 25. Might as well replace them while we're at it because they're buried under those electrolytics. So let's change them out before we do the electrolytics. And something I see here that makes me absolutely sure that these were put in later. Look at the end here sticking out of the lead from this bypass cap. Then it comes over here and it sticks up in the air right here. Somebody was so lazy, they just stuck this in, soldered it, and then left the extra ends flapping in the breeze to cause all sorts of short circuits. Not exactly top drawer work. Okay, we're going to put it in with the shortest possible leads and nothing sticking out the back. Sure enough, look at this. I can't believe it. I've never seen that done before. They just laid the capacitor down with the lead sort of in the proximity of the tube pin, soldered it, and then just left it. Look at this. Good grief. Now that I'm in here, I can see why this solder was done. I think corrosion built up under this grounding lug right here so that it ceased to have ground. So somebody scuffed up the paint a little bit and soldered the lug to the chassis surface, which is actually a pretty good idea. It did a messy job of it, but I'm going to go ahead and redo it and make it look a little better and probably a better solder connection. Here's another little tip. Use your wire stripping pliers to strip the insulation off a long piece of worthless wire so that you can have your little spaghetti insulators for the long leads on things like capacitors. That would shield this 450 volt end here from accidentally shorting or being touched. Okay, it's cheap insurance and it works great. Okay, now the 2 electrolytics and the 2 cathode bypass caps are replaced. I love the smaller size here. It's like an empty spot here now instead of something just crammed with prehistoric capacitors. Next we have this cathode bypass cap from the 6V6 right here, pin 8, which is the cathode. Going to replace it. It's coming over here to a ground that is connected to one of the unused rectifier pins. While we're at it, let's check to see if the cathode bias resistor for the 6V6 has drifted. A lot of times they do, and it'll change the bias of the tube and affect the tone and volume of the amp. So let's see what this is supposed to be. Remember, I don't have a schematic. The way you read these old resistors is body and dot, bed, B-E-D, body and dot, red, green, brown. That's 2, 5 times 10 is 250 ohms, and it is 256.2, so it's fine. Also, I see no evidence of heating, so to me this resistor is in perfectly good shape. This is interesting. There's two separate depth caps. Okay, stereo depth caps, if you will. One on each of the primary leads running to the transformer. I guess that way, no matter which way you plugged it in, whether this one's hot or this one's hot, you got your depth cap right there cutting down on electrical noise. And in this particular case, I'm thinking that with these two depth caps, we're going to do a magic trick here. Now you see. Now you don't. Well, it looks like we have one electrolytic left. It's the first one in the power supply. You see it's coming right from the rectifier where the B plus is exiting, so we'll replace that one next. This is interesting and not something I'm used to seeing, but every solder joint is covered with a kind of a flesh-colored dope, I guess to protect the joint from oxidizing. I don't know, but you can spot every one of the original solder joints because they're all covered with that same material. Very clever. It's time to remove the old power cord, and both of the solder joints where the ends of the old power cord were attached were coated with that flesh-colored dope, so it's obvious that this really was the original power cord. Next I have two 0.05 at 600 volt coupling capacitors from pin 3 and 6 of the 6 and 7. And as you look, 3 and 6 are the plates. So we know these are coupling caps. And really, since they are paper capacitors, probably need to be replaced. Okay, I ran the power cord through a rubber grommet with a little super glue here so that the cord is really snugly connected here to the chassis wall and won't move. White wire goes straight to the power transformer primary. The black wire goes to the switch, the fuse, and then the other side of the transformer primary. Green wire, of course, is securely grounded. So that's it for now. Now it's time to address this volume control, which is absolutely frozen solid. I've tried heat and I've tried external application of lubricants to see if that would free it up, and it hasn't. So I'm going to have to go in and unsolder all of the wires and components that are connected to it so that I can remove it to try to free up that center post. Because this is rather complex, I'm going to draw a diagram showing each of the components, where they go and what they connect to, so it'll help me put it back together. It's a big mistake to trust your memory in cases like this. Make a diagram, it just takes a few seconds. Okay, I drew my diagram, I snipped the connections, and then I removed the troublesome potentiometer. Now it's time to try to take it apart so that we can get inside and free up the shaft and also clean the contacts. Unlike the potentiometer and the Grable amp that I had to repair, this one doesn't have those straps that come around to hold the back on, which made me a little worried, but no, if you carefully pry the sort of tin back will come right off of this pot and let us get inside. Okay, the back's been removed, and now we have access to the shaft and the threaded tubing that are stuck together. So let's see if we can't free them up. In case I can't repair this, it's a 500, they say M, but what we would say now would be K, 500K pot, so half a meg. Okay, I might have to replace it if I can't free up this shaft. Well, after a fair amount of work, some luck, and a whole lot of cussing, I got the two pieces apart and got the shaft here polished and everything cleaned up. This is a Centralab potentiometer, and it's much harder to work on than the ones in the Grable amp. But anyway, it's done now. Let's see if I can get it back together. Now I have reassembled the volume control, and with the help of that diagram that I drew prior to disassembly, I've rewired the circuit around the volume control with all new coupling capacitors. It now turns very smoothly and easily, and I think it's going to serve us well. Well, a total of 12 capacitors were replaced. Now the chassis looks a whole lot cleaner and neater, and hopefully it'll work a whole lot better. I packed up all the old caps and the original power cord in a plastic envelope so that it can stay with the amp. Okay, it's time to see if the amp works. We've got it switched on. We've cranked the voltage all the way up slowly on the variac to a total of 117 volts. It's dead quiet, so you're thinking, this doesn't work, but let's see. Wow. Not only works, but good strong volume. So let's turn it off and reinstall the speaker and the chassis in the cabinet and see how it sounds. Well, I reinstalled the speaker with the original nuts and washers. Sadly, the umbilical cord here is not long enough for me to rotate it so that the flat avoids the tube, but by manipulating the chassis backwards a little bit, I got about 1/8 of an inch of room, and I think that ought to work. Chassis in, and also I installed new rubber feet with those original little Phillips head screws. I still have the old feet. Of course, there's only 3 of them, but I think I'm going to list them on eBay, maybe like $200 or $300 a piece, of course, very much like those old used capacitors that you see for sale for like $30 or $40. I'm thinking these babies ought to bring in some good money. A bunch of viewers seem to think that the robot needed a badge, and I thought, well, maybe a sheriff's badge, but nah, that's too boring. Instead, I got him a nice brothel inspector's badge. So if you're operating a brothel and you hear a knock at the door, don't be surprised if this is what's waiting outside. Okay, we got the guitar plugged in. The volume is at about, I guess, 4 out of 10. I've asked Ollie and Jack to give us some encores of their greatest hits. So let's sit back and see how this little jewel sounds. that's about it for this video featuring this super nice original late 30s, say 1940s amplifier. It took a whole bunch of new capacitors, a few new resistors, and a repaired tone control, and I think it sounds like $1,000,000 now. I hope you do too. So I guess it's time to thank all my Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors. Any of you who would like to join them in supporting our channel, please see the links that I provided in the video description. After the last 10 or so really demanding complex videos, I'm going to kind of take a little break and put out some of these nice basic ones featuring nice old amps getting repaired and demonstrated for you. I've run out of drone footage and I really don't have any more original guitar tunes, so I think we're just going to call it quits at the end of this one and start work on our next video. I hope you enjoyed it. I thank you for watching and I hope to see you again soon.